All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. We're in the web forms section, and now we're up to styling web forms, which is about number 6 or 7 of 11. I think 7 of 11. So in the previous articles, we looked at all the HTML you'll need to create and structure your web forms. In this article, we're going to move on to look at how to use CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, to style your form controls. This has historically been difficult. Form controls vary greatly in how easy they are to customize with CSS, but it is getting easier as old browsers are retired and more modern browsers have it easier to work with. All right, form controls were added to HTML in the HTML2 spec. CSS wasn't released until the next year and wasn't very well supported by browsers for a few years after that, but that's changed over time. All right, even with the CSS available to HTML, browser vendors have historically been reluctant to make form controls stylable because users are very accustomed to forms looking a certain way. All right, so it says for some form widgets, it is still difficult to rebuild controls to make them stylable, but that's really, I think at least, is changing. All right. Not all widgets are created equal when CSS is involved. At present, some difficulties remain with certain form elements. As it says here, these problems can be divided into 3 categories. The good. Some form elements can be styled with very few problems across platforms, including form, field set, legend, input, text area, input buttons, regular buttons, labels, and outputs. Bad. Some elements are more difficult to style or require more complex CSS, so checkboxes and radio buttons. So for instance, if you wanted to change the size of the buttons or whatever, are the checkboxes and the radio buttons. The input type of search, as it says, they'll describe how to handle that later in an article called Advanced Form Styling, which I believe is the one that we'll go over next here. And the ugly. Some can't be styled thoroughly using CSS, including the color, input type, the date time, the range, the file. The good news is the ones that you're probably going to end up using the most often are the easiest typically to style. All right, now that's kind of a generalization, but I think it pretty much holds true. Again, as the author says, they'll come up with what can be done about these ugly ones, so to speak, in the advanced form styling, which will be coming up next. The real problem with these controls, as it says, is that they have a very complex structure. And beyond some basic styling, you don't have a lot typically that you can do with them. If you want to thoroughly customize these, it says you use your own HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is beyond the core of these articles, but there is an advanced article on how to build custom form controls. All right, if it isn't someone at the door, it's the phone ringing. So, says, note here there are some proprietary CSS pseudo elements available that allow you to style some of these components, but these are not consistent across browsers, so cannot be relied upon. All right, so again, I think they're going to break this down. There's the good. And that'll be what's discussed in the rest of this article. So, to style form controls that are easy to style with CSS, you shouldn't face much of any difficulties. All right, so again, with these good ones, there should be very little extra you have to do. You'll treat them like you would anything else you're trying to style. All right. As well as what's been provided earlier in the section on your first form, the CSS building blocks, etc. All right. We've also been provided with several selectors, UI pseudo classes that enable styling based on the current state of the user interface, which will be talked about in a later article. It says we'll walk through an example at the end of this article to give you some more ideas on basic form control styling and placement. But before we do that, we'd like to say a few words about specific aspects of form styling that are worth knowing about. Okay. Number one, fonts and text. As it says here, CSS font and text features can be used easily with any widgets. All right, including the font face. However, browser behavior is often inconsistent. By default, some widgets do not inherit font family and font size from their parents. Many browsers use the system default instead. To make your form's appearance consistent with the rest of your content, you can add that to your style sheet, which basically says for all of these different form components, have them inherit whatever font family has been done above and use it to 100% of its size. So the inherit property, as it says, causes the property value to match the computed value of the property of its parent element, in essence, inheriting that value. All right, so they show you some examples below, and on the left it says this is what you get normally, and on the right it's with the platform's style rules applied. And you can see that typically these are going to be nicer to look at than these are. The defaults differed in a number of ways. Inheriting should change their fonts of that of the parent family. All right, they all do with a strange exception. The submit does not inherit from the parent paragraph in Chrome. Rather, it uses something else, which is another reason it says to use the button elements. And again, it's like anything else. How do you find out about it? You go in and you start creating forms, and after you do, or as you do, you start to go in and test them on different browsers. All right. There's a lot of debate as to whether forms look better using the system defaults or the custom defaults. The decision is yours to make as the designer of the application. All right. We've talked about this box sizing border box a little bit before. All right. But what you have to realize is, for example, if you're working with a certain amount of width, that every time you add padding and you add margin, that by default, it is going to take that width, and let's say that here we'd added 20 pixels of padding and 30 pixels of margin. By default, without this line, now instead of having 150 available, it would be 150 minus 20, which would be 130 minus 30, which would be 100. But by saying the box sizing border box, what you're saying is I want to be able to use all 150, and even if I add padding and margin, do not add those to the size of whatever it is I'm working with. Now that wasn't explained fantastically, so let's hear what they have to say here. All text fields have complete support for every property related to the box model, such as width, height, padding, margin, and border. However, browsers rely on system default styles when displaying these widgets. It's up to you to define how to blend them in with your content. If you want to keep the native look and feel of the widgets, you'll face a little difficulty if you want to give them a consistent size. This is because each widget has its own rules. You may have noticed that much earlier when I gave you my original form example. I'm not going to bring that one back up, but you'll notice that the default size of a text box or an input of type equal text was not the same thing as the default size of a text area, for example. All right. In the screenshot below, it shows the default rendering of this, and the right column shows the same elements with the style rule there above. And again, notice there are some times when you might say there's not a lot of difference, and there are other times when there will be a difference. It says what may not be apparent via the screenshot is that the radio and checkbox controls still look the same. All right, these have not changed, but they are centered in the 150 pixels of horizontal space provided by the width property. The legend placement is okay to style, but it can be a bit tricky to put down where you want it to go. Now, That is, the legend on the top that I showed you was easy to style. The stuff down here can be a little bit different. You probably wouldn't want this here. You'd probably want it up there, for instance. But if you did want it down there, they're asking you to use basically an absolute type of position where you're putting the bottom and the right to 0, which will, by default, shove that all the way over. All right, and they mentioned there that the field set needs to be positioned too, so that the legend is positioned relative to it. The legend element is very important for accessibility, so stuff like this, you cannot put too much emphasis on it. All right, so next they have a specific styling example. I think we've got enough time in here. I believe we will at least. We'll see. So it says, let's look at a concrete example. We will build a fancy looking postcard. So here is what it should look like when you get done. I wouldn't call that personally a fancy looking postcard, but that's what they call it, which is fine. All right. In fact, let's stop right here. Even though we're a little early into this, we're only at 11 minutes. We'll take the example then that's left, and that looks like it's going to take up the rest of this. All right, so I don't have to break this into two different things and cut it off at a weird spot. We'll cut it off right here, and I'll be back in just a moment.